There is a moment in every extended investigation when the analytical picture and the human picture converge in a way that forces a clear-eyed assessment of where things actually stand. That moment has arrived in the Nancy Guthrie case, and this analysis engages with it directly, without softening the parts that are difficult. A retired FBI agent has offered what he describes as a simple motive theory for why Nancy Guthrie was targeted. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings have publicly backed that theory. That combination, a specific theory from an experienced investigator, confirmed as consistent by the people who knew Nancy Guthrie best, is the closest the public record has come to a settled answer to the question of why this happened. At the same time, 3 separate expert contributions this week have moved the analytical portrait of the suspected kidnapper from the general to the specific. The mask and hood theory grounds the profile in the physical choices made during the abduction. The ransom note theory grounds it in the communication evidence. And a bombshell theory about the suspect, described in those terms in the reporting, introduces a claim that goes further than prior public expert commentary. Against all of that analytical progress, there is a medical clock that is running independently of the investigation. Nancy Guthrie has been without her regular medication for 78 days. Whatever that medication was managing, it has not been managed for more than 11 weeks. The biological consequences of that are not speculative. They are real and accumulating. And the family, which has maintained careful public restraint for most of those 78 days, is now speaking. Warnings have been issued. A vow of continued joy has been made. A son-in-law has added his voice. The family's posture has changed, and that change is itself information about where the investigation stands. This analysis holds all of those threads together and examines what they collectively mean for the realistic trajectory of this case. Begin with the motive question, because it is the one that most directly connects the investigation's current state to the question of resolution. A retired FBI agent's simple motive theory has received public backing from Savannah Guthrie and her siblings this week. The backing is significant beyond its evidentiary implications because it represents a family decision to publicly affirm a specific explanation for why their mother was targeted. That decision was made at a specific point in the investigation, after 78 days of careful public management of their communication. And it signals something about the family's current understanding of where the investigation stands. The simplicity of the theory carries its own investigative significance. In criminal cases, simple motives are often more explanatorily powerful than complex ones because they reflect the perpetrator's actual reasoning rather than the elaborate frameworks that outside observers sometimes construct. A simple motive, once articulated, tends to make the choice of victim obvious in retrospect. It explains not just why the crime happened, but why this specific person was the target. What a simple motive in this case most plausibly involves, given the available information, is one of 2 categories. Financial targeting based on the public profile of the family, meaning someone who believed that Savannah Guthrie's prominence meant her mother could be used as a lever for significant financial gain. Or personal targeting based on a specific relationship or grievance, meaning someone in Nancy Guthrie's life or in the orbit of the family who had a specific reason to act against her. The family's endorsement of the specific theory suggests it is one that makes sense in the context of their private knowledge of their mother's life. If the motive were purely the assumption of family wealth, the family's private knowledge would not add much to the public analysis. If the motive involves something more specific to Nancy Guthrie's circumstances or relationships, the family's endorsement is more informative because it suggests they can reconcile the theory with specific things they know about their mother's situation. The retired agent's framing of the theory as simple suggests it is not a complex conspiracy or a multi-layered criminal operation with multiple objectives. It is something more direct, something that, once stated, seems straightforward in the context of the case. That simplicity does not make it less significant. A clear, specific motive that can be confirmed by the family is a more actionable investigative tool than a complex, speculative one. The convergence of expert analytical contributions this week is the most analytically significant development in the public dimension of the investigation since the DNA evidence was flagged as potentially critical. 3 separate contributions from 3 separate expert voices, all arriving in the same week, all engaging with the question of the suspected kidnapper's identity from different evidentiary starting points, represent a form of independent corroboration that is methodologically important. When experienced analysts working from different evidence arrive at consistent portraits of the same suspected perpetrator, the probability that those portraits are pointing in the right direction increases significantly. The mask and hood theory from the former FBI agent grounds the identification framework in the physical execution of the crime. The specific concealment choices made during the abduction, a mask and a hood, are not just noted as facts, but analyzed as windows into the kidnapper's characteristics. The type of concealment, the specific preparation it required, the social environments in which such concealment is natural or expected, all of these are analytical dimensions that translate physical evidence into a profile of the person who carried it out. The former agent's willingness to make big claims about the kidnapper's identity based on this analysis reflects a level of confidence in the analytical framework that goes beyond cautious profiling. Confidence of that kind in a public forum from someone whose professional credibility is attached to their claims suggests that the mask and hood analysis has produced a portrait specific enough to warrant directional claims about who the perpetrator is. The ransom note theory from the second former agent operates at a different evidentiary level, but should arrive at a consistent portrait if both analysts are accurately reading the available evidence. Ransom notes, as forensic documents, carry linguistic, physical, and behavioral information about the person who produced them. The consistent elements across the 2 notes in this case and the differences between them together provide a data set that an experienced forensic linguist or behavioral analyst can use to characterize the perpetrator in ways that go beyond psychological profiling. The bombshell theory about the suspect, described in those terms in this week's reporting, introduces a dimension that this analysis cannot fully engage with, given the limits of what is in the public record. What the framing communicates is that the theory's content is more dramatic, more specific, or more divergent from the existing analytical consensus than what prior expert commentary has provided. Bombshell characterizations in expert analysis are not applied casually. They reflect an assessment that the theory changes something significant about how the case should be understood. The convergence of these 3 expert contributions in the same week, at the same point in the investigation, is itself a meta-signal. Experienced analysts do not all focus on the same case at the same moment without reason. When multiple former agents and expert analysts are simultaneously offering their most specific and most directional public commentary on the same investigation, it suggests the case has reached a point of analytical maturity where specific claims are more defensible than they were earlier in the investigation. That maturity reflects the accumulation of evidence over 78 days, evidence that is available to analysts, even in partially disclosed form, and that has reached a threshold where the expert community feels equipped to make claims they would not have made earlier. The social media post claiming knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's location requires systemic analysis as well as case-specific attention because it represents a recurring challenge in high-profile investigations that has its own logic and its own investigative implications. The post appeared on social media with the statement that the author knows where Nancy Guthrie is. The reaction to that statement, described as disturbing in reporting and as sparking concerns across social media platforms, reflects the emotional investment that the public following this case has developed over 78 days. A claim of knowledge about a missing person's location in a case that has received sustained national attention is received with a combination of hope and fear that reflects the audience's genuine engagement with the case. From a systemic perspective, social media claims of this kind in high-profile missing persons cases are more frequent than most people outside law enforcement realize. They range from genuinely misinterpreted information to deliberate fabrications to, in rare cases, authentic knowledge from someone unwilling or unable to contact law enforcement directly. The investigative process for assessing each category is different, and the category cannot be determined from the post itself without investigation. In the specific context of this case, the social media post sits within a broader communication landscape that includes ransom notes claiming geographic locations, sheriff's department posts that generated national confusion, and an ongoing psychological campaign against the family described by investigators and observers as deliberate and sustained. A social media post claiming knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's location arrives in that landscape and must be evaluated against it. If the post is connected to the person responsible for the abduction or to someone in their orbit, it represents an extension of the communication strategy that has characterized the case. If it is from an unconnected individual operating within the categories described above, it is a parallel noise event that requires investigative assessment but is not part of the abductor's strategy. Distinguishing between those possibilities is exactly the kind of investigative work that consumes resources at a moment when those resources are focused on the DNA analysis, the ransom note examination, and the 4 Tucson detentions that are already part of the active investigative picture. This is the type of analysis that this coverage continues to provide as the case develops, and subscribing ensures you receive it as developments arrive rather than after the news cycle has moved past them. The systemic assessment of the Nancy Guthrie case at 78 days requires engaging honestly with all 3 of the realistic outcome categories that the evidence and expert commentary currently support. The first category is a breakthrough driven by forensic evidence. The FBI's DNA analysis of the hair samples recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home is ongoing. The expert analytical contributions this week have built a specific portrait of the suspected perpetrator. If the DNA analysis produces an identification, and if that identification aligns with the portrait that the mask and hood theory, the ransom note analysis, and the behavioral profiling have constructed, the investigation moves rapidly from the analytical phase to the operational phase. That transition can happen quickly once the forensic foundation is in place. The second category involves the geographic intelligence from the Mexico claim being developed into something actionable. If the ransom notes claim that Nancy Guthrie is in Mexico is geographically accurate, and if investigators pursuing that lead in coordination with Mexican law enforcement produce a verified location, the case shifts from a national investigation to an international operation. The complexity of that shift is significant. Cross-border operations require coordination between legal systems with different procedures. They take time, but they have been conducted successfully in cases with comparably complex international dimensions. The third category, which this analysis engages with directly, is the one that the detective's chilling theory from last week has placed in the public record, and that the UCLA professor's grim reality framing has confirmed is analytically legitimate. At 78 days without medication for an 82-year-old woman, the biological consequences are accumulating in ways that the investigation cannot undo. Every day that passes without resolution is a day in which the medical situation, whatever it currently is, continues to develop in directions that are not good for Nancy Guthrie's physical well-being. The grim reality of the statistical picture at this point is information that investigators factor into their urgency calculations, even when they cannot share it publicly. The family's response to all of this is the human measure of where the case stands. Savannah Guthrie's vow that they will not take our joy is a statement made by someone who knows about the medication crisis, who has been briefed by investigators on the current state of the forensic and behavioral evidence, who has received the taunting ransom note personally, and who has chosen in that context to communicate publicly in terms that signal continued resolve rather than despair. The choice of those words in that context is information about the family's current posture and possibly about what they have been told about the investigation's direction. Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni's warning adds another voice to that posture. A sign outside their home has raised questions about the specific content of the family's current communication strategy. The coordinated nature of the family's public shift this week, multiple family members across multiple platforms communicating in terms that are more active and more assertive than at any prior point, suggests a collective decision that was not made impulsively. Collective family decisions of this kind in active investigations are typically made in response to something, either information that has shifted the family's understanding of the case's current direction or an accumulating frustration with silence that has reached a threshold where active communication feels more appropriate than continued restraint, or a combination of both. What that something is specifically remains in the category of things that this analysis cannot know from the outside. But its existence, reflected in the coordinated shift in the family's public posture, is itself one of the most significant signals that the case has generated in 78 days. The shift in the Guthrie family's public communication posture is worth examining as a systemic signal rather than simply as a human interest development, because it has structural implications for how the investigation is being managed and where the public record of this case is heading. Families in active kidnapping investigations exist within a framework of guidance from law enforcement. That guidance is not always explicit, and it is not always followed, but it shapes how family members typically approach public communication during the investigative phase. The guidance generally recommends limiting public statements that could compromise the investigation, affect witness accounts, or alert the perpetrator to what investigators know. The fact that the Guthrie family is now issuing coordinated warnings, vowing continued joy, and having individual family members contribute separately to the public communication record suggests either that investigators have reduced the restrictions on what the family can say publicly, or that the family has made an independent decision that the benefits of public silence no longer outweigh the costs. If investigators have reduced restrictions, it suggests they believe the investigation is at a point where the family's public communication no longer risks the things it risked earlier. That could mean investigators believe the perpetrator's awareness of the investigation has reached a level where additional public pressure does no marginal harm. It could mean the forensic phase is sufficiently advanced that the communication strategy the kidnapper might use against the family has been neutralized. Or it could mean investigators are using the family's public communication as a tool to apply pressure at a specific moment. If the family has made an independent decision, it suggests that 78 days has reached a threshold where the psychological costs of continued public restraint have exceeded whatever benefits that restraint provided. Families in extended kidnapping cases are not passive. They are people experiencing an ongoing trauma that is compounded by the requirement to maintain public composure in a context where every visible behavior is observed and interpreted. At some point, the requirement to maintain that composure without a corresponding progress in the investigation becomes unsustainable. The family's shift this week may reflect exactly that threshold being reached. The specific language Savannah Guthrie chose is analytically significant, regardless of which of those explanations is correct. "They will not take our joy" is a statement that addresses the kidnapper directly, by implication. It says that the psychological campaign, whatever its ongoing form, is not achieving its intended effect at the level the family is willing to publicly acknowledge. That is a counter message with a specific intended recipient. The bold warning is a different register of communication. A warning implies a consequence that will follow if the warned party does not change their behavior. In the context of an ongoing kidnapping with an unidentified perpetrator, a warning from the family implies either that the family has information suggesting the perpetrator can be identified and acted against, or that they want the perpetrator to believe that is the case. Either implication serves the family's strategic interest in this communication. The systemic picture that emerges from this analysis is one of an investigation entering a different phase, one where the public communication strategy of the family is becoming more active, the expert analytical record is becoming more specific, and the internal investigative pressure from the medical clock is increasing. Those three factors together compose a set of conditions that typically precede a significant development in a case of this complexity and duration. What that significant development looks like, when it arrives, and what it will mean for Nancy Guthrie and for the people responsible for her abduction remains to be determined. But the conditions for it are accumulating, and the analysis will continue to track those conditions as they develop. The memorial, partially removed due to HOA concerns, is in this systemic frame, a detail that reflects the community's own experience of a case whose duration has exceeded what anyone in the neighborhood expected. HOA governance, neighborhood signs, family warnings, expert theories, forensic analysis, and a medical clock that does not stop. All of these exist simultaneously in the Nancy Guthrie case at 78 days. They are not separate stories. They are different expressions of the same sustained situation, seen from the perspective of the people and institutions most directly affected by it. One final element of this week's developments deserves direct engagement in any complete systemic analysis. The Savannah Guthrie mid-episode departure from her broadcast in a prior week, which was not explained and which generated widespread speculation, can now be read in the context of the family's coordinated communication shift this week. The departure was a reactive moment. This week's warnings and vows are strategic communications. The movement from reactive to strategic in a family's public posture during an extended investigation is a recognized pattern. Families move through stages in how they manage their public presence in a case. The early stage is characterized by shock and careful management. The middle stage involves accommodation to the ongoing reality and a developing sense of what the investigation requires from the family in terms of public communication. The later stage, which may be where the Guthrie family is now, involves a more active and strategic engagement with the public dimension of the case. That later stage arrival does not necessarily mean the investigation is close to resolution. It can also mean the family has reached a point of sustained engagement where passive waiting is no longer psychologically or practically sustainable. When a family has been living with an investigation for 78 days, has received multiple communications from the person responsible for the abduction, has heard expert theories about what may have happened to their mother, and has been managing their public presence with extraordinary care for nearly 3 months, the shift to a more active public posture can reflect any combination of those factors. What the shift tells the analysis is that the family's relationship to the case has entered a new phase. And new phases in family communication, particularly when they are coordinated across multiple family members, as this one is, are worth tracking with the same analytical attention that the forensic and behavioral evidence receives. The investigation is at 78 days. The analysis continues.